and welcome to another episode of the Orchardcast. Now on video, I'm your host, Jeremy Appel, speaking to you as always from Treaty 6 territory in what you may know as Edmonton. When we talk about racism and oppression in Israel, the conversation generally focuses on the treatment of the Palestinians, and understandably so. It is the Palestinians who are the ultimate victims of Zionism. But if we're interested in puncturing the founding mythologies of the Israeli state that justify the Palestinian subjugation, it's worth critically interrogating the idea of Israel as a haven for Jews. It turns out that in the Jewish state, not all Jews are treated equally. We know that Israel was founded by European Jews fleeing persecution in countries like Germany, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Lithuania, among others, to establish a European outpost in Palestine. But the European Jews didn't flock to the Middle East as planned. So the Zionist movement adopted plans to absorb 1 million Jewish immigrants from countries like Morocco, Algeria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. Many of these Jewish immigrants fled persecution in the Muslim world, but they found themselves facing a new kind of persecution in the nascent Jewish state. These Mizrachi Jews were crowded into slums, such as Musrara on the eastern outskirts of West Jerusalem, with subpar social services and educational opportunities on land that was taken from Palestinians. It was in Musrara that a group of young Moroccan Jews in the early 1970s formed a group calling itself the Israeli Black Panthers. Tipping their hats to the African American civil rights struggle, the Israeli Panthers weren't quite the Marxist revolutionaries of their American namesake. But the Israeli authorities saw the Panthers as a major threat to the country's social cohesion and treated them accordingly. Asaf Elia-Shalev is the author of the 2024 book, Israel's Black Panthers, The Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth. He joins me to discuss the Israeli Black Panthers' legacy and why it matters on the other side of this funky jazz interlude. Asaf, welcome to the Orchardcast.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm really excited to talk to you about Israel's Black Panthers and whatever else you want to ask about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just finished reading the book. It's very good. I highly recommend it. But I want to start by asking you how you first became aware of and interested in the Israeli Black Panthers.
Yeah, it goes back to my 15 more years ago, to when I was a college student at UC Berkeley. I was then as now, the campus was at the center of all kinds of radical activism, and I was very interested in that at the time. And the American Black Panthers were founded in the next town over in Oakland, and had a lot of history on the campus of UC Berkeley. And so I decided to write about them on a couple occasions for my history papers and things like that. And I came across a reference to the Israeli Black Panthers. And this was the internet of 15 years ago. So there was far less information available, also less misinformation. So on balance, who knows which is better? But I could find almost nothing except for kind of a Wikipedia page that said that they fought for for equality and against racism faced by Middle Eastern Jews or Mizrachi Jews, and I thought, wow, that's curious. It was fashionable at the time to kind of examine your roots and understand where you come from as a political act, right? So I grew up as a white person in the United States, and so it was kind of, well, you also came from somewhere. You should be interrogating your roots and finding out, situating yourself culturally and all that. So I was like, wait a second, I know that my family is from Iraq and Bulgaria, Sephardic Jews from Bulgaria and Iraqi Jews on the other side. And I thought this was a kind of a big, this raised a lot of questions for me. Growing up in the United States, I felt a difference from American Jews because they almost all were Ashkenazi. So there was some pronunciation stuff. There were certain assumptions about what Jewish food is, but I never felt like oppressed by that difference. And so I really wanted to know more. I went to my elders, to my father and grandfather and others, and was really hoping for stories about how, the best thing that a young radical at Berkeley could find out is that the grandfather was a Black Panther. So I was hoping for that, and like that wasn't the case. But there were a lot of stories family stories I began to uncover, and it was very valuable for me to learn about the prior generation's experience of arriving in Israel and living through the 70s and 80s and until I came along. And so I did all the reading I could about the Mizrachi issue. I read people like Ela Shochat and Yehuda Shenav, and wanted to understand from my very privileged position, having grown up primarily, I was raised in Israel for a number of years, but primarily I grew up thousands of miles away in California as a white person, and here I'm, trying to connect with with what it meant that my brown skinned family moved to Israel, we inevitably faced racism, what that was like, and even if my experience isn't characteristic of most Mizrachim in Israel, what did they experience? What was that like, and how can I come to understand myself as part of a whole? Meanwhile, things were happening at Berkeley. Like, there were a lot of Arab students at Berkeley, and once word got out that I had Iraqi heritage, there was a thing that they used to do. They take your glasses off, they tell me. So I take them off, and apparently my eyebrows are much bushier or much more Arab looking without the glass. You could tell, and they changed my name from Asaf to Asaf. So that was this acknowledgement, and I just needed to know what that was all about. What this line that separated Arabs and Jews all of a sudden seemed so blurry. And I learned how my grandfather used to listen to Kulthum and Abdel al-Wahhab and all the great Arab singers, and how my dad was so ashamed and embarrassed about that and would never bring friends over because he didn't want them to know that my grandfather was continuing to live as an Arab, essentially, right, with his big Arab mustache, and right, who has a mustache in the Israeli imagination? That was, at the time, it was like Saddam Hussein has a big bushy mustache, just like my grandfather. And let's see. And then I was also kind of moving away from being an activist to becoming a journalist as I was graduating from college and entering the workforce. I happened to go to Israel, or when I go to Israel, I moved to Israel to work at Haaretz as a news editor. And I meet Reuven Abergel, who's one of the founders of the Israeli Black Panthers. And we strike up a conversation, and we come up with this idea that I'll interview him because, right, I'm starting to become a journalist, right? So what do? I want to interview him about his life story. I'm kind of amazed at this a stroke of luck, uh, and his voice just seems so urgent and so different than everything else you hear in the public discourse. Um, and so we sit down, we do maybe 50 hours of recorded interviews, uh, and he's just in this. He sounds like this voice just can't be suppressed, and yet no one's heard of before. I don't really know what to do with that. I'm in my mid-20s at this point. Meanwhile, I'm also developing as a journalist and falling in love with the genre known as narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction or literary journalism, whatever you want to call it. And which by that I just mean that factual stories, but written with dialogue and plot and scenes and character development. And I kind of decide that I'm going to write the story of the Black Panthers. No one had done it before, certainly not in a comprehensive way, and almost nothing existed in English. And so I kind of arrogantly, as someone who was 26, 27 at the time, decided I'm going to do this. This is how I'm going to make my mark and make an intervention into the discourse around Israel and Palestine. Maybe I answered more than your question, so I'll let you kind of give it back to you.
No, that's great. I was wondering though why you think this chapter of Israeli history is so little known.
Well, we tend to think about Israel in binaries. There's the Arab and Jew, Israel, Palestine. The two shall not meet. And here, the Mizrachi story drives a wedge into that binary and breaks it apart. You have more than half of the Jews in Israel trace their roots to the Middle East, to Arab and Muslim majority countries. They come to Israel with Arabic. It's kind of an uncomfortable or difficult to explain dynamic if you are just focused as an outsider on thinking about a country as a binary between the white Jews and the brown Arabs or any of those, however you want to break down the binary. The Mizrachi story complicates that. And so a lot of people have a hard time with nuance and complication, and it doesn't fit into any of the pre-existing narratives. And I think that's one reason. The other reason is that, this of course has been kind of embarrassing. It's embarrassed Israel, and Israel for many, many years, for many decades, tried to present itself as a very white country in terms of who they sent to be represent it abroad. Today, that's totally different. Israel now emphasizes its diversity. But for most of its history, that wasn't the case. Why is it also so little known? I mean, part of it is also just the failure of intellectuals in Israel and in the United States to give the story its due. And Israeli universities didn't make room for many brilliant Mizrachim found themselves without space to engage in critical thinking about Israeli history in at the universities near where they lived, and so they ended up in large numbers moving abroad. So we have a whole generation of brilliant Mizrachi scholars, and so they've tried to break through and make this story known. Yeah, I think those are the reasons. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you nailed it with the fact that this sort of complicates narratives surrounding Israel and its foundations. I think you do a good job in the book outlining why that I love these
I'll tell you
Hasbara.
what Reuven might say. Reuven Abergil, my main character,
Yeah,
might say. He doesn't speak English very well. He speaks better than he acknowledges, but he says that the lack of English kind of helped keep his story trapped within the confines of Israel, right? And
hmm
so people tend to think about the Mizrachi kind of struggle as some internal novelty almost when they hear about it, whereas he says the struggle should have been seen as part of a global struggle for human rights and social justice, and it never got its due, because Israel was a small country where things didn't really come out unless those who spoke English and had the resources allowed them to come out.
yeah. And I think you noted how Israel now presents itself as a diverse nation, and a lot of its Hasbara, its propaganda talks about, oh, well, how can we be colonialist when half the population's from the Middle East? And I think you do a good job outlining in the book how those aren't like mutually exclusive, that Zionism from its inception was a European colonialist project according to its founders. But that doesn't mean that every Israeli Jew was European settler trying to bring European civilization to the Middle East, right? There were people caught up in that project who were looked down upon by the founders and the ruling establishment of the Israeli state. But I think in order to understand and contextualize the Israeli Black Panthers, I think it's important to understand the status Mizrachi Jews occupy in Israeli society. So, who are the Mizrachim, and how are they treated by the Israeli mainstream?
You mean today or at Israel's founding?
Historically, but also how
Historically.
that might have evolved.
Yeah, so let's go back way before Israel's founding, when Zionism emerged to solve a problem specific to the Jews of Europe, the pogroms, the anti-Semitism, the terrible, terrible violence that Ashkenazi Jews faced. And the proposed solution was to create a European-style state in Palestine, to create a state for the Jews modeled on Europe. And Herzl said so explicitly. He said that when we go to Palestine, the Germans will see that we too are Germans. So kind of expressing that equality for Jews is somehow predicated on settling Palestine. Zev Jabotinsky, right, the founder of revisionist Zionism, predecessor to the founder of the movement that eventually became Netanyahu's Likud, he said that the project of Zionism is to expand the frontiers of Europe all into the Middle East and all the way to the Euphrates River in Iraq, actually, but certainly in Palestine. The problem with that was that most Jews in the early 20th century didn't listen to the Zionists, and they moved to North America instead. That's why we have such a robust Jewish community in this country. After that, there were still a lot of Jews left, but the Nazis exterminated 6 million European Jews that could have gone to Palestine. And by the end of World War II, most of the Jews that are left are either the Holocaust survivors that are in the displaced people's camps, or they're locked up behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviet Union won't let them leave. And it's really only then that the Zionist movement starts paying earnest attention to the million or so Jews that live in Muslim countries. And they see that they have to turn to this reservoir of people that are increasingly unwanted in their countries. But they also are kind of kind of hesitant and ambivalent about the prospect of bringing in masses of Jews who resemble in many ways the Arabs that are the enemy to Israel and the enemy to Zionism, right? So they know they need people to work the factories and to pave the roads and to be soldiers in the military and to settle the frontiers of the country, because the 600,000 European Jews, mostly European Jews who are there when Israel was founded, just that's not enough people to make the vision of the Jewish state real. On the other hand, they bringing all these people, all these Jews from the Middle East, they're very aware is going to necessarily change the character of the country and make it much more difficult to achieve that vision of a European state for the Jews in Palestine. And so from the very beginning, that dynamic plays out in racist policies and racist rhetoric from the Israeli establishment. So David Ben-Gurion, we have minutes of meetings talking about Mizrachim as being prone to crime, being unclean, disease-ridden. Right, just a few years after the Holocaust, you have the Prime Minister of Israel, the founding father of Israel, talking about Jews in these terms. Haaretz, a newspaper I worked at, sent a correspondent to North Africa and to France to see the Mizrachim who are about to arrive, and he is horrified at the population that he's encountering there. He describes Mizrachim as dirty Africans, and talks about that they like to gamble and they like to rape and they like this and that, and he's really warning this. He's trying to warn the Israeli public about this coming menace. Ordinary Ashkenazim, who aren't journalists or prime ministers, you have a term that they use to refer to Mizrachim in everyday conversation, which is Shvar Tzechaya, a black animal in Yiddish. And so if you think about it, Black Panther is kind of a reclamation of this racial epithet that was used against Mizrachim for many years. And once you have these warnings in place about this coming influx of very dangerous people, you're pretty well justified in taking action against this supposed danger. So the Israeli government starts to enact policies that exclude Mizrachim from the centers of power and privilege. They are tracked into vocational school, not given equal opportunity to achieve academic degrees. They're given menial labor instead of being allowed to access the workforce as anyone else would. They're settled, instead of in the center of the country where there's opportunity, they're settled on the frontier where there's no economic opportunity. People are forced to live in like tin shacks or tents in many places, and where there's like immediate danger of Palestinian militants attacking or Arab armies attacking. So and people aren't even the police is used to enforce this settlement pattern. People are prevented from leaving these like kind of tent encampments on the frontier, and really there's a creation of a second-class citizenship for Jews in Israel. We see, the sociological evidence shows just from one generation to the next, a huge drop in all metrics, of income, status, socio-economic status. Just there's a massive drop. Mizrachim were coming from major cities of the world like Casablanca, Istanbul, Cairo. These were major metropolises, and now they're living in these little development towns, where they were part of the world. They spoke French and English and Arabic, and now they're in these like little ethnic ghettos, where they're only with themselves. And the Ashkenazi kind of establishment is very fearful of these people, very suspicious of them, needs them, is kind of resentful about needing them. and is very concerned about maintaining the character that they had envisioned for the country. And that's kind of that's what carries us through the first 2 decades of Israel's existence until the Panthers emerge and challenge that paradigm. There were many others who challenged it before, but the Panthers broke through in a major way, and since that time, you wanted to bring it up to now. I mean, Mizrachim have made massive strides compared to what things were like in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The inequality is not as stark as it was. There's a massive Mizrachi middle class. There's very wealthy Mizrachim. So they've had success in commerce and in media and entertainment. Everyone listens to Mizrachi music, whereas in the past, like, there was official policy that kept Mizrachi music off the airwaves. What other realms? I mean, in a lot of ways, there's more representation in parliament, although here's where we start to hit the limits of Mizrachi achievement and movement towards equality. So to this day, the government of Israel is still dominated by Ashkenazim. The prime ministers, there's never been a Mizrachi prime minister. All the main ministries are all tend to be controlled by Ashkenazi ministers. The judiciary is dominated by Ashkenazi judges. Academia is, I think the number is like insane, like 90 to 92% are Ashkenazi, leaving 8% from Mizrachim and Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis. And also the grievances, the historical memory of the really kind of starker periods of inequality and the deliberate kind of policies of discrimination still flare up in all kinds of ways, especially during election season. Israelis still talk about Mizrachim and Ashkenazim. They tend to claim that there are no differences anymore, but the jokes still bite. The stereotypes make clear very well who has power and who doesn't, or who has less power at least. And you still had a member of like an activist within the Likud apparatus just, I think, 2 years ago, have an outburst where he said, "Oh, the Nazis should have eliminated all of you. He shouldn't have left any of you alive," which is a reprehensible thing to say, and is not the appropriate response to whatever your perceptions are of inequality between Ashkenazim and Mizrachim. But the fact that he said that in this angry outburst suggests that this grievance is very much still alive.
And it's worth noting, too, that Mizrachim aren't just Arab Jews, right? They're also Persian Jews and Turkish Jews and Kurdish Jews, all with their own distinct histories and cultural practices. Now, you don't really get into this as much in the book, but I want to ask you about how the Israeli state went about constructing this unified Mizrachi identity that encapsulated a whole array of different cultural experiences.
Well, there's the founders of Israel and the people running the show were swimming in the same intellectual waters as the Europeans were, right? As the wider European society, and in many ways, ideas that fell out of fashion in Europe kind of continued to be popular in Israel, right? It took a while for the memo about racism to being on the out to reach Israel, and we could talk about that. But so sorry, I digress there. But whatever the racial attitudes were imported from Europe. And according to this racial attitude, there are the worthy races of the world that happen to be concentrated in Europe, and there's everyone else, and that could mean you're Indian or Moroccan or Turkish. And so when groups were coming from these different countries, there were already racist assumptions about their needs and capacities, and they all were all grouped together because they were seen as it was seen that their differences didn't really matter. They were of a inferior human level. There was this idea that being amongst Muslims, regardless of which country or the specific of your culture, had degraded the cognitive and spiritual level of the Jews. And hopefully with exposure to the superior European Jews, they would be able to be rehabilitated within some amount of years or generation. And so we have minutes from meetings talking about we have limited housing, and of course the Polish Jews that are coming in, they need proper apartments, but these other people, like, they don't need that. Like they can suffice with like little shacks. The Moroccan Jews could they're okay with that. And so and the Israeli kind of statistics bureau made that division very clear when it generates statistics about Jews, and there was the grouping into Jews from Europe and North Africa. Jews from Europe and North America were one group, and Jews from all the North African and Middle Eastern countries were grouped together as separate, and statistics were kind of kept based on those divisions. And slowly, not actually that slowly, the experience of being racialized in Israel, of being treated as another because you come from the East, forged this new Israeli Mizrachi identity. So people still held on to their Turkish heritage, but now they had a way to build solidarity and say, hey, we're all experiencing this thing. We all live in this little ghetto. We all are stuck in Dimona. Now we are alike, and we're Mizrachi, and that term comes into fashion. And I don't really use the term Arab Jew very much. I'm not like against it or anything. I just try to stay as faithful as I can to the kind of words that Mizrachim use. And Mizrachim is like kind of an aspirational term in many ways. It's a coalitional, aspirational term. There's like people organized around the concept of people of color in the United States, that is intended to be descriptive of a certain racial experience in the United States, but it's also intended to build allyship and solidarity across racial lines. And I think a lot of people use Mizrachim in that same way. And some people don't, and that's fine. Some people are like, no, I'm an Iraqi Jew, and that's okay too. I'm not here to tell people what words to use, and I kind of and there are differences in how the Israeli state treated the different groups, right? So it's true that there was like this unifying experience of being racialized in Israel and marginalized, but Iraqi Jews were treated better than Moroccan Jews, and there's all kinds of reasons for that, and we can get into that if you're interested.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Let's. I am interested in this.
People really wonder also, what about the Ethiopian Jews that came later, and they were like black in the sense that, black in the way we mean black today. I want to remind your listeners, in Israel, the Mizrachim don't look black in the way that Americans today might use that term, but they were the darker skinned people in Israel at the time, and they talked about themselves as black. And as I mentioned, many Ashkenazim referred to them as Shvarzechaya, black animal. So that was the language of the time. I'm not imposing a contemporary American term on Mizrachim, like I am using how it was understood at the time. And different groups had different uses for the Israeli state. So Iraqi Jews, for example, were considered more highly educated and spoke the kind of Arabic that was useful for the intelligence services. And so it was easy to integrate at least some Iraqi Jews into the establishment. Yemeni Jews were viewed as somehow, because they were a little bit more isolated from other Jewish communities, they were seen as something closer to the biblical Jews, as representing some sort of authenticity, and so they're exoticized in this weird way, but also marginalized. Moroccans, there was a special kind of contempt and paranoia around the Moroccan Jewish community always. They were the biggest diaspora group, and are the biggest one today. They arrived in very large numbers to Israel, and they had this innate kind of solidarity amongst them that was very threatening. So when the Moroccans, if Israel's scared of a big group arriving and changing the character of the state, Moroccans were the real thing you need to worry about. Ethiopians, sure, there was racism against them, but they were less of a threat. They weren't too small of a number to like change the entire character of Israel, and so there didn't need to be as much of a systemic reaction to that. Yeah, so those are some of the differences.
Yeah, and the Panthers were a group of mostly Moroccan Jews.
Yeah,
centered initially in Musrara, which is a slum on the eastern outskirts of West Jerusalem. And I was wondering how, I think you've laid out sort of the plight of Mizrachi Jews in Israel. So what was the catalyst for this group of sort of Mizrachi street youth in Jerusalem setting up an organization that was named after the Black Panthers?
So this group of kids who would become the Black Panthers were either born in Israel or arrived as babies or as young children, and their parents bring them to this. They kind of refuse to go along with the program of being settled on the frontiers of Israel, and they're like, "We've been praying to Jerusalem since time immemorial. We're going to go to Jerusalem, whether you like it or not." That's the attitude for these people, and they flown to Jerusalem. Where are they going to live? Well, the only housing that no one's offering housing, so the only place that they can find where to live is in this border zone separating East Jerusalem from West Jerusalem. These are bombed out houses that where Palestinians had previously lived, but they fled in 1948, and it's right against the old city, like you said, the eastern edge of West Jerusalem. But it's a no man's land, and there's barbed wire running through the neighborhood, and there's snipers from the Jordanian side and the Israeli side, kind of exchanging fire from above and sometimes shooting at residents below. And they fill these houses. It's extremely crowded, unsanitary. Sewage is running through in an open canal through the neighborhood. There's almost no government services, hardly even a school, and later just a religious school. Most of their interaction with the Israeli state is through the police that comes in and arrests kids who maybe stole like a piece of fruit from the market or scavenged from the no man's land and try to sell metal or different fixings they could find in the bombed out housing. And you have a whole generation of young men in particular who get in trouble with the law, end up in juvenile institutions, in and out of them, and they're without a job. They don't serve in the military because the military won't take anyone with any kind of runnings with the law at this point. and they end up as what was termed at the time street gangs. These are thousands of young Mizrachi men, not just in Jerusalem, but throughout the country, throughout the cities, that kind of loiter around, get into trouble, try to look tough. And the girls in this time are still more beholden to the traditional kind of expectations of them, so that you're more likely to find them in the home. The boys are in the streets amongst themselves, organized by age, typically around a charismatic leader, maybe. And things were kind of in this state, and then when event happens to catalyze tremendous amounts of change in Israel, and that's the 6-Day War in 1967. For one thing, Usrara overnight almost goes from being the backwaters of Jerusalem, which itself is the backwaters of Israel at the time, to the very center of a super exciting city. Now all of a sudden, Israelis can go and explore the holy sites that were blocked off because they were under Jordanian control. And the whole world becomes interested in Israel, interested in Jerusalem. All these phenomena that were going on in the world and hadn't really arrived in any major way to Israel are come rushing in. I'm talking rock and roll music starts arriving, psychedelic drugs, radical politics, the hippie movement. All that stuff's coming in. It's coming in as media, right? As magazines or albums, vinyl records that are coming in. Or I think this is even a different format from before of music. And visitors that are coming, or it's like Ashkenazi, kind of well-off Ashkenazi Jews who are traveling to Europe and visiting the student revolts in Paris and visiting the United States and seeing what's going on there with the civil rights movement and bring that back to Israel. And the people that are, I would argue, kind of positioned to take full advantage and are just imbibing this influx of culture more than anyone else are this street gang youth, right? And in particular, this group of young people that are from Musara. They love the foreign culture. They start wearing their hair long. They start dressing like hippies. They start taking on the symbols and icons of the radical movements of the rest of the world. They're very excited to be having sex with all the visitors that are coming in from abroad, where they're the kind of the sexy, authentic thing for the visitors, and they love the idea of, right, they didn't have any access to that. So it's like this concoction of everyone smoking hashish and sex and talking about fighting the power. And many of the people in this group that become the Panthers didn't even know how to read, and now they're suddenly working with social workers, these really innovative social workers who are starting to empower them through education, and they're learning about the world in these ways. One of the things they're noticing is that there's a lot of articles in the newspapers about the American Black Panthers, and concerns seem to be that they're anti-Semitic because they were making pro-Palestinian statements, and they were talking about overthrowing imperialism and American imperialism, and allied with that, the Israeli state. And the main takeaway for these youths reading about the Panthers was that the Israeli establishment was very, very scared of this group. And they decide to they're going to emulate them. They start to understand that just like the Panthers were claiming this power and Black power and organizing their community, they too say, hey, the inequality and the poverty and just the way my life is messed up, that's not just about me. That's something that my whole community is experiencing, and I want to stop it. I want to understand why it's happening and tell the government to make a change. And so they kind of put out this very preliminary threat of becoming the Black Panthers that kind of percolates into the media before they've really organized anything. They had not yet established membership or an agenda. they just kind of said, we want to be like the Black Panthers. And and it's really the reaction to that, to putting out that statement, that galvanizes them further. All of a sudden, reporters are descending upon the neighborhood, trying to figure out who the Panthers are, what they want. There's a Knesset hearing, like, lawmakers are talking about this. So much attention. They're like, wait, we're onto something. We have to keep going. And it goes from there, and we can talk about what happens next. Or you can direct me any way you'd like.
Well, it seems almost as if initially in 1971, when the Israeli Black Panthers were formed, the decision to name themselves after the Black Panthers was almost an aesthetic decision, right? It was more of like an attitude than like a common political program that they shared with the African American revolutionaries. You write in the book about how the Israeli Panthers were quite different from their American namesake. The original Black Panthers were revolutionary Marxists who wanted to tear down the American state. The Israeli Panthers, by contrast, registered as a charity in Israel, seeking to reform, quote, the regime in Israel so that it would become a country with no discrimination among the groups that constitute the Jewish nation, unquote. But the Israeli state almost treated them the same as the American state treated the original Black Panthers, surveilling them and infiltrating them, arresting their leaders, and violently suppressing their demonstrations. Why did the Israeli authorities, which, as we've established, are dominated by an Ashkenazi elite, see the Panthers as such a threat